Hi Facebook. I just thought I'd do this prompt you live because I'm sitting out here. I'm supposed to be unpacking the boxes from the market yesterday and the market the previous weekend, and I haven't done that. So I just thought I would jump on and just sort of do a recording, I guess, of the workshop or the talk that I did at the Queen of Wands at Blackwood the other weekend, or just from some of my notes so they are recorded before I lose this notebook. So I did sort of talk about witchcraft and for the Southern Hemisphere, and I started off with the word witchcraft itself because it's a highly emotive word these days, and it seems to have even more interpretations than originally did, especially amongst practitioners themselves. Everybody calling themselves witches, everybody's having their own different interpretations of what witchcraft is, what it means to be a witch. And for somebody like myself who I suppose got first, that's not very good English, was first involved in witchcraft or came across the word witchcraft and practicing witches in the modern concept, probably in the late 80s, early 90s, that'd be about right. And compared with what is classified as witchcraft today, I, to be 100% honest, don't really understand. And sometimes I find myself struggling to understand why something is called witchcraft when, I suppose, in my concept of the thing, of the whole world of witchcraft, it's not actually witchcraft, but that doesn't mean to say that it's not, but it's just I don't understand. And yeah, so in order where I'm coming from a very sort of historical aspect of witchcraft, it's always been, in my opinion, a religion. We've seen from the witch trials of the 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th century that witches were accused of devil worshipping. It was considered to be a rebel, an opposition to the Christian church. There was a belief in the goddess, and even one of the very first or most important sort of trial records, I do have some notes here that I'm looking down, in 1384, the case of Madonna Oriente in Milan, Italy. The woman there confessed of having participated in the society around the goddess Diana. So that was in 1384. So even back then, it was seen as a religion. Today it seems to be described more as a practical craft. In that, I mean, it seems to be the craft of the witch, so the witch is creating spells, or that seems to be what most witches seem to be doing these days. Spells, spell jars, manifesting something or banishing, protection, which is fine. It seems to be a focus also around the use of baneful herbs. There's a lot of aesthetics about being surrounded by skulls and the spooky stuff, I guess you could say. In a way, witchcraft to me has always been sort of related to someone who delves or lives on the edge of society. So not quite an outcast, but not quite in the popular circle, so to speak. And it's always been perceived as a rebellion or someone who rebels against social norms. So for everybody who calls himself a witch these days, maybe this is a good time to sort of just ask yourself, why? What does witchcraft mean to you? Which of these identifications fits with you? Are there any others? Are you sort of aligning with the religious aspect that dates back to, as far as we're aware of, at least the 14th century? Is it just a practical aspect of what you do? Are you a caster of spells? A practitioner who is fixated with baneful herbs? someone who dwells on the edge of society, or a rebel. Is there any other descriptions that you would use to describe what witchcraft means to you? As I said, witchcraft, from what I was originally trained in the 90s, so sort of probably shows my age, pre-internet, social media. We actually had to go to the library if there were actual books in the library. The local bookshops often only had one or two books, classic books, often in mythology. There weren't actually occult sections, and we hung around what was becoming known as New Age or metaphysical bookshops. So it was a lot harder to come across people than it is today, which I think also sort of explains why some of us older practitioners, should I say, sort of struggle a little bit with all this instant, spontaneous knowledge that's out there. And yes, I'm not saying that what we did was, or the knowledge that we had back in the 90s, early 2000s, was 100% correct. Like with anything, more knowledge has become known. People's views and attitudes certainly have changed. But there's also, I suppose, a danger these days of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, and there's a lot of dissing, or, you know, us old-timers get accused of gatekeeping, yet there is sort of a refusal, or I won't say what's the opposite of gatekeeping. There's still an element of, I don't even know what the word is, but negativity, I suppose, directed from other people coming into the craft. Maybe there's a right to have that opinion, I don't know. These are just some of my thoughts on this Sunday afternoon, because as I said, I'm refusing, or I'm not putting away stuff in boxes. What people don't tend to recall, especially in the last, say, 20 years, if your introduction to the craft has only been 20 years ago, is that before then, as I said, there weren't a lot of resources out there widely available. They were out there, you just had to actually look very hard. And I suppose this is one of the aspects of the term seeker. You really had to seek. You just couldn't log on to the internet and ask somebody. Well, if you did that, you might not get any answers, because people might not want to know or share that information with you. However, probably one of the bigger, or the most, or the good word, probably one of the more, what I'm trying to say, markers in changing this information about witchcraft, or how we view witchcraft, came in the late 80s, early 90s through Llewellyn Publishing, and in particular a book, just listening to my pigeon that's nesting out in the veranda. Okay, a book called Wicker, A Guide for the Solitary Practitioner by Scott Cunningham. Now these days, you mention the word Wicker, people jump up and down and, you know, insult it, which is, I suppose, one of the reasons why I decided I would do this chat, because someone had recently posted, I'm a practitioner of 20 years and this is my blog, and well, they've made some interesting points. One of the first blog postings they sort of bit their chest about was, not all witchcraft is Wicker and harm none, and they were quite derogatory. Now, I don't know what they mean by Wicker, whether they meant Alexandrian Gardnerian witchcraft, or if they mean sort of this eclectic style of witchcraft that stemmed from this book I'm talking about, Wicker, Guide for the Solitary Practitioner by Scott Cunningham. Because from a more traditional point of view, what Scott Cunningham put in his book, even though it was a huge success, I think it still is a very successful book, actually has little, if any, truth when you're comparing that to, a more traditional Alexandrian Gardnerian perspective. I suppose there is a similarity in that, yes, we have a dual deity, believe in a god and a goddess. But yeah, people have differing opinions. I suppose it's a good book for a beginner, but there's also a lot of misinformation, and which has led sort of like opened up a whole new can of worms. In particular, the association or connection with the word Wicker to, I suppose these days, and this is what I was sort of talking at the beginning, what's called now traditional witchcraft, which tends to mean non-Gardnerian influenced witchcraft. Now there seems to be, this is just my opinion, misunderstanding that anything that Gerald Gardner or stemmed from Gerald Gardner created, invented, continued, whatever you want to perceive. I'm not here to dictate to people. I really don't care what other people will think. I've got my own thoughts on it. That is called Wicker, and traditional witchcraft is anything supposed to be Robert Cochrane or this focus on skulls and baneful herbs, and that's all true witchcraft or traditional witchcraft. So Gardner is Wicker. Now it's really interesting because Gardner in his books very rarely used the word Wicker. He spelled it with one C, not two C's. Now whether that was due to his wasn't really dyslexic. He was self-taught, he was self-educated. So his lack of spelling wasn't the best. Was a mispronunciation, but he also only mentioned, or when he did mention the word Wicker, was calling witches children of the Wicker. He used it as a noun. He didn't actually call the practice Wicker. Though, I know there's a quote, and I do mention in Contemporary Witchcraft, shameless plug, that now I've got a bee coming into my room. Fantastic. Spring. There was a bit of a argy-bargy with Charles Cadell. There was another sort of opposing when Gardner started coming public about witchcraft. All these other witches seemed to pop out of the woodwork. One of them in particular was Charles Cadell. And there's some comment in papers between Gardner and one of his high priestesses or priestess of Gardner's, and they were making fun of James Cadell. If I've got the name right, I may not have the main name right. So that was the only time that they called it Wicker. But Gardner himself always called it, was practiced witchcraft. Alexandrians had always called themselves witches or witchcraft. It seems to be, from my opinion, maybe it's an American thing, I don't know. It's interesting because the word witch, looking at it, is actually from the Anglo-Saxon, the Old English, and it was originally pronounced witcher. So it might have been spelt how we would spell Wicker, W-I-C-C-A, but that was actually pronounced witcher. And the Old English, Anglo-Saxon, was actually a gendered language, coming in from the Frisians or the Germanic languages, so it was actually a gendered language. So the feminine the feminine word anyway, was witchy, so it was spelled with an E, W-I-C-C-E. So when the English language sort of evolved, and we've got this modern language, which is a non-gendered language, they're only just taking the singular word witch, and they've actually spelt it how it sounded, W-I-T-C-H. You can, if you want to Google linguistics, there's a whole lot of more expert people talking about how the Anglo-Saxon language in particular, how they pronounce sort of like double C's, like a ch sound. So with it actually being an Anglo-Saxon word, it's sort of important to keep in mind that it's a word relating to a group of people, maybe doing a certain thing. largely in England, in the countries of the Anglo-Saxon. It's not actually a word to describe magical practices all around the world. That has been a later addition when the British colonialists went off around the world with their Christian ideals and saw other practices from other people which they identified weren't Christian, so they must be witchcraft. So this is how we get other practices around the world described as witchcraft, where they may be either spiritual or magical practices or even folklorish. However, they're not in their true sense witchcraft. It's just a practice that these white colonials didn't identify as Christian, which, if you can imagine, if you're out from about the 17th, 18th century, there would have been a lot of practices they would have come about. So, what am I trying to get at? These days, it seems to be you draw a pentagram on something and it's automatically witchcraft. No, it's not. Witchcraft, to me, yes, it is a spiritual practice. Yes, it is a religious practice. And again, the word religion is sort of a contentious word these days. It involves magic in all forms, and I think it should be pointed out that there is more to witchcraft than just doing magic. Magic, at least according to how I was taught, there are 8 ways of making magic, and one of them is spell casting. So maybe people can expand their practice. I don't know. I'm just flicking through my notes to see what else I can talk about. As I said, fast forward to the 21st century, it's highly emotive. There was an article on the ABC, Triple J, and I think it went on to the ABC, Facebook page or news reel, and they were actually talking about witchcraft, and it was actually interesting reading some of the comments about the article, not necessarily the content of the article, but the subject of the article. Here we are in the 21st century, and the ABC and Triple J and the reporter were getting abuse on the subject of witchcraft. So even today in the 21st century, there is still this I wouldn't say it's political, but it's a real sort of negative perception still in relation to witchcraft, a fear factor. And I don't know, maybe it's just these uncertain times that we live in. I know in various countries around the world, people are still losing their lives, being accused of being witches or using witchcraft, whether they have been or not, whether it's used as a catch-all word these days simply for magic, but there is this element of fear on both sides. There's a fear of someone allegedly creating spells and casting magic or being a witch. There's also almost like a sort of projection of, oh, I'm a witch, I have to be spooky, which I find really interesting, especially now that I'm having to get onto social media feeds to publish or promote my books a little bit more, like Instagram. The true witches are all full of baneful herbs and spooky aesthetics and skulls, and yes, I've got a skull. You can probably see the horned god behind me, and I've got some skulls out there, and yeah, I guess being an older woman, some people find that spooky, but it's a little bit sad in a way. I feel it's sad because it's almost like sort of pigeonhole witch back to that old stereotype that for, I don't know, 300 years people lost their lives over, and it's almost like we've gone full circle back to wanting to reclaim that aesthetic of fear. And I'm not saying that just because you're interested in baneful herbs and skulls that that doesn't, you shouldn't do that, but there is more, again, as far as I'm concerned, of the craft, more to it than just baneful herbs. It's all about balance. Maybe this is sort of a reaction to this Wicker that Scott Cunningham brought in the late 80s, early 90s, that turned out and became very whitewashed, very love and light, which the blog that I briefly mentioned was still having a go at all these people who have interpreted the Wiccan Reed and none do as they will as all love and light. And it's just like, well, if you actually read the reed correctly, it doesn't actually say that. It's a reed means a guidance. It doesn't actually tell you what to do if things do harm. It just says, it actually interprets it, if you read it correctly, that like in most religions or spiritual beliefs, you're aiming to live as best as you can without impacting too much upon anybody else around you. It's not saying that we're just having to be whitewashed versions of existence or anything like that. So, yeah, so maybe this sort of interest in skulls and baneful herbs is just a reaction to the 2000s up to 2010, the sort of whitewashed neo-pagan Wicker, which has now been interpreted as Gardnerian Alexandrian witchcraft, which it isn't. But again, if that is you, if that's something that you like, well then knock yourself out. I really don't care. As I said, this is just me sharing some thoughts, trying to understand what is deemed as witchcraft these days. So we've got to the scary, spooky witchcraft. We've got the feminine self-empowerment where everybody can be a witch, and again this sort of ties back into the 2000s when it was seen as feminine. I just said that, feminine self-empowerment. It was geared at younger women. You still see it today in a lot of the social media memes. Everything is geared towards the female. Maybe it's because we are more emotive creatures, and it's a good way of selling something to us because we've had this repression from the patriarchal yada. But it's gotten to a stage now where if a man is interested in witchcraft, he is considered, in some cases, an alien, not wanted. And again, I find that ironic considering in the modern revival, and that's what I would call it, the traditional style of witchcraft, we have Gerald Gardner, we have Alexanders, we have Robert Cochrane, we have even Charles Cadell, all men. So there is this element of masculinity in there. We have, the dual duality of a moon goddess and a hornet god. Again, duality. It's very important. If you look back to, I suppose, the original revival, people say that it was Gardner, but it's been proven that Gardner was actually initiated into a coven, so it predates Gardner. He was just the first one to talk about it when the witchcraft laws were repealed back in the 1950s. Witchcraft up till then was perceived as a fertility cult, and it's been a few years since I went to school and did biology, but in order for something to procreate, you needed a male and a female. So witchcraft was deemed as a fertility cult. So there was this balance there. Okay, 21st century, maybe with the world population, maybe we don't need to be getting it on that way all the time these days, but there is still the element of fertility, but it's fertility in a different concept now. There's fertility of the mind. There's fertility. We're using that energy of the divine masculine and divine feminine to procreate a better environment, better understanding, connection between us and the divine, which sort of leads me to another puzzling aspect that I did actually find the answer to on Thursday night, was this more recent fixation about casting circles in salt. Now, again, as I said, it's been a while since I went to school, but when I was at school, we were told about salt was corrosive, it destroyed the land. We talk about salination, you can see it around where I live, if you live close to the coast or down the salt lakes, how it's with the water table, of everybody sort of like boring into the water table, how the salt level rises as well, yet modern witches are throwing salt on the ground by the ton of it, and I don't understand. It's almost like this connection with their natural environment. And I know back in the day, when I say that, I say back in the 90s, early 2000s, when we were all pagans, to want of a better word, we were deemed tree huggers, and because the environment was important to us, and it's still important. We hear the young kids these days out there protesting about the environment, yet I wonder if these are the same young kids who are interested in witchcraft who are casting their circles of salt. Now, I don't know why we do use salt. In my tradition, it's just a little couple of handfuls or tip of from the thame into the water to bless the water, and then you asperge the water around. But someone informed me on Thursday night that this came from the television program Supernatural. Supernatural, yes. I don't know, I've never actually seen the program. So I guess back in my day, we didn't really have any such programs that were influential. Probably later in like 1990s, early 2000s, there was The Craft, there was Charmed, there was Buffy. None of them, I don't think, poured circles of salt. But I don't know whether people are taught in schools these days the dangers of salt or the damage salt can do on the land. If that's the case, then why are people calling themselves witches but still using this practice? Maybe they're just influenced from a television show, which is a little bit disappointing that they're not sort of understanding that a television show is actually fiction. So yeah, we'll just sort of move on. Just looking at my notes. Feminine, we'll go to the feminine self-empowerment. Social media aesthetics seem to focus on beauty, on the perfect display of something with a pentagram on it and a nice collection of crystals, some beautifully placed herbs, and a candle burning. That's witchcraft. That's all, well and good. Witchcraft to me has always been messy. I've got wax on my carpet. I've got holes from where charcoal bricks have exploded. It's sort of, again, taking away this sort of hands in the mud aspect of witchcraft, making it appear that it's all perfect. And even though I've just dished a little bit on Scott Cunningham, I think it's in one of his books, he's actually mentioned about some of his mistakes. I know Ray Buckland mentions in one of his books some of his mistakes that he's done. Back in the day, I used to do full moon circles in the park, and I remember when I first got my sword, and was it before the legislation changed or afterwards? I don't know. I just thought I'd just show off, basically. Confession time, yes, I showed off. Or attempted to, and swung my sword around and did this big sort of like into the ground, and I got my cape caught underneath the blade. And so I basically pinned myself into the middle of the circle. So yes, so witchcraft can be messy. The number of times I've burnt myself picking up incense or the censer or spilt wax on me or other things like that. You don't see those sorts of things on social media. I mentioned there seems to be a focus on alleged spell casting and the sort of, I don't know, people want to magic away their problems or their issues to have this perfect life, and it's we are here in this incarnation, whether you believe in reincarnation or not, we are here in this physical body for a reason, and that is to experience the good, the bad and the ugly. And if everything was all love and light and plain sailing, if you had no noisy neighbours or upset parents or dogs barking when you're trying to do a ritual or anything else, then you would never learn to grow spiritually. End of story. These things, sometimes it's just because not everything has a magical interpretation to it. I know that's a little bit, blasé these days. I saw someone come across, snail casings, the shell of the snails after the birds sort of sucked all the insect out of it. A snake's an insect? No, probably not. And they wanted to know what they could use the snails for. What was the magical purpose of the snail shells? And a whole lot of people came up with all these different reasons. Some of them were quite innovative. One person mentioned that some cultures ate snails and their personal opinion to that was ugh. Which I sort of, the idea to me is ugh. I don't fancy eating snails. However, I've never tried it. But that poor person got slammed for being disrespectful to these other cultures. And it's like, as far as I'm aware, and you can correct me if I'm incorrect, in countries like France where they do eat snails, it's a different kind of snail than my average garden snail here. I personally don't like my snails because they eat my cabbages. So I'm quite happy to leave my snails to the birds. I don't think there's some magical property to them or purpose to them. And I'm certainly not going to utilise harvesting even more snails so they can eat my cabbages, considering my birds will probably be wanting to eat something else. So, using magic to magic away life's problems. Like I said, life is for living. I don't know why people would want to do that. If anything, I personally would probably magic ability to understand why, if I'm going through a difficult time, is there a lesson in that for me? Or to sort of like coast through the waves of change a little bit better, especially if I'm looking towards the past more. So if you want to magic away your issues, I'm not saying you can't, it's just like, I think it's almost like putting blinkers on and refusing to expand and grow in a situation. But I guess you'll only find out in the later on. I see experiences often occur to us like dreams. They'll keep repeating, they'll keep changing, but the underlying message will still be the same until we actually learn that lesson. If we don't learn the lesson, or we keep ignoring dreams, they'll start turning into, especially if it's a warning, they'll start turning into a nightmare, especially if they have something really important for us to... Yeah, Jason, I don't know. I said I've never actually watched Supernatural. Maybe I should. I don't know. And I think even before they're charmed a little bit with demons and things. I know popping out of the woodwork left, right and centre. It's just, I have a different take on witchcraft. I've got better things to do. I'd rather commune with higher energies. I suppose this is what I'm getting at. This fixation on spellcrafting only and also to do it over very mundane issues, to me is very low magic. And I know witchcraft is low magic, and ceremonial or high magic is called high magic purely because one's sort of more earthbound or physical realm centered, the other is more spiritually or cosmic centered, in that you're working with archangels and higher level beings. Not saying that you can't work with higher level beings in witchcraft, but I don't know, if you seem to focus on more day-to-day stuff, it's like everything is brought down to this physical realm. So as a spiritual person, you're not sort of growing. And maybe it's just, again, an age thing. The longer I've walked this path, and I know my practice has changed, but the more I sort of focus on, so lifting my vibration, doing ceremonial magic in particular, maybe I'm more of a magician than I am a witch. I don't know. But it seems like the day-to-day stuff doesn't have that hold over me as much. It's like, it's almost like an annoying little mosquito. It will go away. You flick it, it will go away, because my focus is on something else, something a little bit more underlying, something a little bit more lasting, a little bit more important. Doesn't mean that I don't worry about things that are happening on the physical realm, the here and now, because this is where I'm residing. And yeah, things do affect me, and I've just done a video that I'll be uploading tonight about, there's a lot of planetary happenings between now and February next year. And a lot of it is to do with karma and unresolved issues and healing in relation to that. And I'm seeing veils drop, and whether it's just my own veils, like I've had these, idealisms in relation to people, or how people should, it's my perceptions on things, and the realization, I guess, that maybe my expectations, I've known this for a while, are far too high. And that's one of my biggest issues, is that my expectations are way too high, even my own expectations of myself. And now feeling at the moment I need to sort of withdraw again. Maybe it's just me becoming more of a introversion peaking, which is ironic because I'm sitting here staring at my phone and I'm seeing people watch me. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff happening, I think, and maybe I just need time to sit and figure it out. Next year should be an interesting year. Things will be moving a little bit more. And this is one thing that I was linking to. I'll link to this video. Even if it might sound a little bit new agey to some people, what Jocelyn Starfield is talking about is that we've had a lot of really big planets in retrograde for most of this year, including Jupiter, which is the planet in relation to expansion. And now these planets are all righting themselves again. So there's a lot of this energy that's maybe you feel that you've been stuck is now beginning to be released. And yeah, there's a lot of big players happening. And I'm not an astrologer, but I found it really interesting. So I decided to share some of my thoughts. But yeah, that's another thing. I'm just waffling now. So, yeah, I said this has started off being a few notes that I made the other weekend, having a go at people who don't call themselves seekers anymore. They call themselves baby witches, which, yeah, it's just like, think of the words. Baby means dependent. So I'd rather spend time with a seeker. To me, that means that they're actually actively looking for something, actually going to be applying themselves, as to a baby who just sits there and needs stuff to come to them, wanting their instant results. And looks like I'm going to have to go because my phone is telling me that it's about to die, and I need to plug it in. So this is a Sunday afternoon waffle. So there's a few people on: Evelyn, Anna, and Jace. I hope you guys are well, and enjoy the rest of your Sunday afternoon. I'm going to have to plug my phone in. I've got family obligations coming up, so I might do this again some other time. Okay, take care. Blessings.